Hi, everyone. Welcome, Priya and Mary, to the DTE space. First, I will introduce you, and then we'll get into some questions. But I will say that the way that we sort of came to this conversation is you all invited me to be a part of the process of another anti-racist book club, and I was just super excited and grateful to be in that space. So wanted to bring you all here and sort of in the spirit of Signal Boost, amplify the work that you're doing. So I'm just super excited that you're here with us today with me and Maya. So first, Priya. So Priya Budavarapu, is that correct? Did I get it? Yes. She is a senior environmental science and policy major at the University of Maryland, along with serving as a core organizer for another anti-racist book club. She is currently an intern at the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Office. Priya grew up mostly in Gaithersburg, Maryland, along with a few stints in New Delhi and Hyderabad, India. And she identifies as a brown Telugu American woman. I hope I pronounced those things correctly. Excellent. Thank you for being here, Priya. Is there anything that you want to add that's not in your sort of formal introduction?
Yeah, I think you pretty much captured it. I'm just happy to be here today.
Thank you. And so Mary Murdock is a senior English major with minors in rhetoric and music outside of school and AARBC, another anti-racist book club. She is also an intern with the Alternative Breaks program at UMD. Mary grew up in Carroll County, Maryland, and identifies as a white woman. Thank you for being here, Mary. Anything you want to add?
No, thank you so much for having me, though.
Awesome. And Maya, do you want to introduce yourself real quick? This is your first time on Signal Boost.
Yes, hi, glad to be here on Signal Boost. My name is Maya Walker. I use she, they pronouns, and I am currently serving as the graduate assistant in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Diversity Training and Education. And outside of that, I am a master's student in the School of Public Health, getting my MPH in health equity. So super excited to be here. I love the idea of this book club, and let's get into it. And so with that, I think I actually have the first question. And so my question for you both is, what's your background in facilitating conversations around anti-racism? Were there any specific resources, whether that be tools or inspiration, you drew upon to help you create this group? And especially if you feel comfortable like naming what resources or inspirations, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, I can go first. So I have no background in this kind of thing. The most facilitation I've ever done is in like classroom discussions, but not on the topics of like racism or diversity and equity, nothing like that. But I really came at it because I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but like I saw Mary put out this call for like a book club and was really interested. So obviously before jumping into it, I think we both did a lot of research. We shared these primer tools that we wanted like all members to read before kind of jumping into the work. And so we did research for that, and like we found, I think what we ended up settling on are a couple of like resources from like Teaching for Tolerance is one website that we found pretty helpful. We found like this primer for teaching or talking about race in predominantly white institutions, because we kind of knew that a lot of the people coming to this would be white, and so it would be kind of a tricky dynamic to encounter. And obviously a lot of the organizers ourselves were white. I'm not, but like I'm not Black, so similar dynamic. And then I actually personally found a lot of like Instagram anti-racist like activists very helpful. Like I'm thinking of like Layla F. Saad, who does like the Good Ancestor podcast and wrote Me and White Supremacy, and like Rachel Cargill, who does a lot of anti-racism activism. So people like that I found really helpful.
Yeah, I do have somewhat of a background in facilitation, just in social justice conversations in general through my work with Alternative Breaks at UMD. I've been in leadership there this is my second year. So I have some facilitation experience, but just like Priya said, not really in the specific topic of anti-racism. And I think it was really important to both of us that starting this organization, this community, we also be learning alongside everyone else, because we acknowledge that we're in no way experts on anti-racism. So Priya did a good job of listing a lot of the resources that we came to when we were just starting off. And like she said, it was really important to us that everybody at least be somewhat on the same page. We recognize that everybody who was joining our community was coming from different places. It was also really important to us that it not just be college students, or that it not just be people in a certain discipline or profession, but that it actually be like a community of people who are coming at anti-racism from multiple levels of experience and past engagement. So that's where the idea of those primary resources came from. And we did do a lot of research through many anti-racism tools, but we did end up whittling it down to those few that Priya listed. And I too have been coming across some good resources on social media, and kind of another part of my experience with the topic of anti-racism is, as an English major at UMD, I've taken several classes about like Black literature that's focused on social movements and anti-racism, but that's always been coming at it from an academic standpoint within the academic institution, and in terms of more of text analysis than a social justice lens. So it was really important to me also that we find resources that were public resources, publicly accessible, accessible in terms of their language, and yeah, just to get everybody on the same page.
So I'm realizing that, as usual, I'm going slightly off script, but I'm kind of wanting to rewind back, because I think we're jumping in and like really talking about like, you know, those first deciding how to put this script together, but I'm wanting to go even before that. Like, what was the idea stage like? Because I sort of heard this like reference around like there was a Facebook post that Mary made, but like what was going on at the time? Like, what was your intention when you put in, like when you posted that Facebook post versus how you feel about it looking back at that moment? Like, what shifted since then?
I can start just because we were referencing the post that I made, but so like around the end of May, early June, we were all, I think, experiencing a lot of like an influx of news around racism, anti-Black racism in the US after the murder of George Floyd, and the news of the murder of Breonna Taylor as well, kind of resurfacing in that time. And so social media was being flooded with a lot of some really helpful resources, some other things that maybe weren't as helpful. And weeding through all of that was, I think, getting taxing for a lot of people. But we also encountered some lists of books that were discussing anti-racism, or that were around elevating Black voices, Indigenous voices, people of color's voices, nonfiction and fiction. Just a lot of different book lists were coming out. And a lot of people seemed to really want to engage, which I think was kind of new from my perspective, just seeing like really a mainstream want to engage in those things as opposed to just kind of a small subset of people. So we came across these lists, and I kind of posted on my Instagram a really like quick story that was just like, who wants to be in an anti-racist book club with me? And I ended up getting a lot of responses of people saying, I would totally do something like this. And I was like, oh, like I didn't even know if people were going to respond to that. So then I ended up making a bigger Facebook post that was like, here's kind of my really rough idea of what an anti-racist book club could look like. I have no expertise and would love help organizing it, but if anybody's interested, please comment. And I got like tons of comments, tons of DMs from people saying they would love to be involved in something like that. And Priya and our other core organizer, Devora, who couldn't be here today, both responded to that post saying that they would love to helped me to organize it. And so the three of us kind of came together in this group of kind of thinking through ideas of how to best organize a book club when I think there were like 83 people or something that liked my post, which was just a lot of people. Obviously, not all of them were necessarily going to be genuinely interested and take action, but like that was a lot more to manage than I thought the interest level would be. So I was really grateful to have those two kind of step in. And Priya, if you want to talk a little bit about our process of how things went over the summer and how they've changed since then. I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
No, yeah, I mean, you kind of captured the, don't like this word, but kind of the zeitgeist of what was happening at the time. Yeah, so I know, amidst all that, like the news and whatnot, I saw that Facebook post and was like, oh, this would be a good way to sort of sustain my interest in what's happening right now and keep it happening beyond the end of the news cycle. And I think that was also one of the motivating ideas generally that's kind of stuck with us, is like, how can we engage in anti-racism in a sustainable way, in a way that's more meaningful than just like, like how can we keep this going beyond our meetings and beyond our reading the book and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think in like June we started putting the actual book club together after Devora and I contacted Mary. And initially what we had was just this huge Google Doc of like ideas and brain dumps of like, how are we going to do this? And it's like 6 pages long and it's a mess. But it's like, we gathered up a huge book list of all the books that we'd seen floating around on social media, tried to group them a little bit and figure out like what was our mission, what were meetings going to look like, how often were we going to meet, like the platform, and also sort of figure out the structure of it. And that took a little bit of time, but eventually, yeah, our first meeting was in July and we read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, because it would seem like a decent place to start for a lot of newcomers. Yeah, that was sort of the beginnings of it. Mary covered a lot of like why we did it and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and I would also like point out that like since then it's been a very like evolving process. Things have changed a lot even in the last 2 months in terms of like what our community looks like. We started a Slack initially because we felt like it would be the best way to organize everything, and we were doing everything in this very like highly organized way because we had so many people interested. 65 people initially joined the Slack. And so we wanted to have facilitators as well to kind of break out into breakout rooms because we knew we were going to have to do this virtually. But we also wanted to make sure there were people present in the conversations that like had an idea of how to facilitate a conversation about anti-racism, because things like that in small groups can kind of devolve really quickly if there's not somebody there to kind of hold it together and keep people moving toward the mission. So that was our initial thought, was to have these facilitators, and we started with this wonderful group of 9 facilitators, including the 3 of us core organizers. And we trained with Sika. Sika gave us a really fantastic like quick training rundown of just how to facilitate a conversation around anti-racism, because it really wasn't something that most of us had a whole lot of experience with. There were some teachers in our group, so they had experience with like kind of leading a room in a conversation, but it's also like a very different thing than facilitating a conversation among peers and having difficult conversations about anti-racism. So that kind of started out that way. And since our first meeting, we had 45 people at that first meeting, which was a fantastic turnout. And we had all of our facilitators lead their own breakout rooms. And then at the next meeting, we did see like a significant drop in participation, which I guess that was in August, but there were still, I think, 15 or 16 people at that meeting. And we ended up just having it all in one big Zoom room. And it was a beautiful conversation about Bell Hooks's Killing Rage, Ending Racism. And we realized after that conversation that it was likely that there was still going to be some drop off in the community. And we did kind of think about like ways that we could continue to engage people, even if they couldn't attend the meetings, putting resources into the Slack, and, you know, just hoping that like even the people who aren't able to attend the meetings are seeing these resources, reading the books, perhaps, or reading some of the books, and like entering into the conversation at whatever level is, you know, possible for them right now. Because a lot of people are facing a lot of difficult things right now, and it's hard to commit to something like that, and we get that. So that kind of changed the shape of the meetings a little bit, so that we no longer have this solid group of facilitators, but instead it's more of a fluid, rotating thing, where some of the people who were trained are still volunteering to help us write the discussion guides, and we're kind of doing that collaboratively, and to like be present in the meetings to play that role of facilitator. But it functions more now like your average book club, where we're all just in a room together online, having this conversation about the books that we read. So that's kind of how it's progressed since June.
It's amazing to see that you all have been able to sustain like all of the amazing things that you're doing. And I think as times have been like adjusting and things, I feel like you guys have kind of just, it seems like you guys kind of just kept rolling with it. I am curious how, you kind of, I think, Mary, at the end started to touch a little bit on like the different things that might like challenge people's ability to like be present. And I think that as you were speaking about it, you were thinking more so what I heard was like in like a physical sense of like physically being able to show up. But I'm curious like how people were like mentally maybe able to show up. And I think as you mentioned that Sika kind of gave you some tips on how to start facilitating these conversations. I think something that I've noticed is that in these conversations, people sometimes shy away from getting like deep into the content, or like it takes a while for people to get comfortable in that. And so it's kind of just like people tiptoeing around each other, or like, I don't know, I always think of it as like the culture of nice. And so I'm curious like how that might have shown up in your group. Like, is that something that showed up in your group? And like, how did you guys kind of work through that, or what did that look like?
So I think I remember at least at the first meeting, within accountability groups, like, which was the smaller groups, like that's how we referred to them. At least within, because Mary and I facilitated one together. And again, it is predominantly white, so it's a lot of people who probably haven't like thought or talked about these issues too in depth before, unless they've addressed it specifically in the past. And yeah, I mean, there were a few moments where I could see people being like struggling to name something or really confront topics, but for the most part, I think because it was so intimate and the books were so like we had a text to kind of guide us and react to. There was almost something upon like where people could use a jumping off point and be like, here's what I thought about these concepts, or here's how this made me feel. And for the most part, I was actually really surprised with how vulnerable people let themselves be for a lot of people who hadn't actually met each other before, and virtually too, which maybe like offered them a little bit of remove or safety. But yeah, I think in general, I was very surprised at how vulnerable people let themselves be and how eager they were to sort of dig into these things, especially with strangers, which can be pretty, pretty intense to do.
Yeah, I would absolutely say like I've been really pleased with the way that like people have interacted in our conversations, like for the people that are present. one thing that Sika taught us was also like not to shy away from those difficult things and to continue asking guiding questions that really like dig into how people are responding to something, how they're like feeling about it, and like to unpack those things rather than to just like let them pass by. And that's something we take into account a lot when we're writing our discussion guides, because we do that like the Sunday before each monthly meeting. We get together with a couple other facilitators, whoever's available, and we just spend an hour writing up some questions to guide our conversation. And we really try to like move away from the desire to analyze the text, kind of like I was talking about earlier. There are a lot of college students and teachers in our group, and I think we're so used to looking at reading that way because that's how we're taught in school. Like we're supposed to analyze the text, and we're not really supposed to talk about like how it exists in our lives and how we're responding to it, and how we're seeing what's happening in the text happening around us, or not seeing it. And we're not really like taught to make that personal connection. So that's been a challenge for me, especially as like an English major, because I'm always like, have evidence for your claims. And I'm like, that's not what this space is for. So but it's been really enjoyable learning how to do that. And not just enjoyable, but like, it feels like a more fulfilling learning experience for the like purpose that we're trying to do this for, which is to understand the world around us better through these voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are writing these books. So I don't know if I might have kind of gotten away from your question a little bit, but yeah, that's something that we keep in mind a lot. In terms of like engaging the people who aren't necessarily able to be physically present, I think that we've kind of settled on the fact that like we have this digital space in the Slack, which I think does work well. And I think it's a good space for, keeping people up to date and providing resources for people. I will say that it's not engaged in a whole lot by people who aren't Priya and I, and like some of the other facilitators. But I think at this point, like having that space there for people, like it kind of has to be enough for me. And because you can't really force people to engage at a certain point, they have to really want to. And that's why we're here, is to have that time set aside each month to at least have a conversation. I mean, we're also always saying like, even if you haven't read the book, like come by. There are plenty of people. I have even not completely finished the book some months. And the conversation is still like a really good one to have, because like Priya said, we're using the text as a jumping off point. We're not talking about the beginning, middle, and end, what's happening in the plot. We're talking about like how it feels to read these things, what we're seeing in our daily lives, what other people are seeing that we haven't necessarily considered. So yeah, that's kind of what this space has been like.
I'm wondering, like, as I hear you all talk, it's funny to contrast it with like sort of where you were initially when we first met, where at least for me, like there felt like there was this vibe of like, we know that we're not experts. Like we know that like we've never done this before. I'm not sure how this is going to go. How are people going to show up in this space? Like there was just a lot of like well-placed anxiety around what this process would look like. And I don't know how to describe the space that you all are in now, but it's definitely different. And I think it just reminds me, like as you were talking, as both of you were talking, I was thinking about a class that I had the other night. So I was facilitating a dialogue for 7 weeks, and it's over now. And so we had our last session last week, and the last class of dialogue, you talk about like action steps, or how can you apply like all the stuff that we talked about over the semester. And to me, it felt like a lot of the students really felt like they sort of had to prove that they were either that they either were already engaged or involved in some sort of action, or that they needed to prove that they were going to be. And one student said something around like, you know, she's like, yeah, I've like gone to, you know, I've gone to this event or I've gone to this protest, but nothing grand yet. And something about her like adding that qualification like really reminded me of sort of where you all were at with like, I know I'm not an expert, or like, you know, like this. So it just feels like there's a lot of pressure to sort of be this like, you know, I don't know, MLK kind of like iconic like person who's like doing something really, really visible, really, really impactful. And I'm just wondering like, what has your experience been like as you've gone through this process of leading this club, and maybe dealt with some of those pressures yourself?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that because I can definitely relate to wanting some kind of qualification or like stamp on my resume to be like, yes, I'm qualified to do this. I think part of that is definitely like the student mindset though, in which like you're always used to getting graded on things and you really want someone to objectively say like you can do this. But yeah, I mean, I think I've gotten more, I can't speak for Mary, but like I think personally just working with Mary and Devora and like seeing how people are eager to kind of show up and talk about these things, like it makes me less nervous of like they're not really asking for experts to facilitate these things. They're just asking for a space in which to like ask questions and learn together and, you know, kind of grow in an understanding of like what is anti-racism, what can I do to be better, and like how can we do that together. That's all they really want. And so a lot of those initial anxieties about like I don't really know what I'm doing are still definitely there, but I think they've sort of grown less, like I'm not as worried about that anymore because I'm realizing that it's not really necessary to try and do what we're doing, because the whole point is like it's a community of people who are learning together, and rather than like us teaching the participants or anything like that. So
Yeah, Priya, you put that so well. And I love that you said like that we're a community of people who are learning together, because there's no, what's very exciting about this space for me is that there's no real desire to have expertise or a right answer, like to have somebody tell you what to do. And I think in a lot of just in like life right now, or always, but especially right now, I think a lot of times conversations have this feeling of like, what do we do? What do we do? What's the grand solution? Like, what is the grand thing that I'm supposed to be doing? And I personally am often in this space of like, I'm not doing enough. And I think a lot of us feel that way sometimes. But what I really like about this space is that we're not claiming to do anything more than be a book club. And I think that alleviates some of the pressure. Like, obviously, we have a mission that states that like we want to like elevate these voices, and like create a space for like a dialogue about anti-racism. But there's nowhere in our mission that says we want to find the answer. We want to like solve the problem. I think that alleviates some of the pressure of needing to do something big and huge. And like Priya was saying earlier, like find actually some sort of sustainable way to engage with anti-racism and come together once a month and talk about it, and then go off into our own lives. And that conversation is still living in our heads, and maybe we live our lives a little bit differently. That to me is like what the space is for. But like, I think it helps that we never tried to make it a space to solve the problem or answer the question or find the one solution.
yeah, and I think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to
just,
ask another question, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think one thing that probably influenced our anxieties is that, like, none of us organizers are like Black or Indigenous. I'm South Asian, but like, that's a very particular type of racism that I've faced, and it's definitely not anything comparable to like racism that other communities have faced, especially like the Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. And so I think part of our anxieties definitely stem from like, not only are we not like quote unquote experts, but like we haven't really, like there's an emotional and physical distance from a lot of what we're reading about and talking about. And so we need to be really careful and respectful of the people who actually do go through these and these issues. And like Mary said, like part of our mission is to elevate like Black and Indigenous voices in these conversations. So that kind of influences our text selection a lot. So yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing question, but I think the focus we've learned is to really focus on learning and growing and not worrying too much about like, are we doing it right?
Yeah, I think you pretty much summed up what I was gonna like say about Mary, Mary had shared around like, it seems like you guys were really using kind of like this group education space as a way to like further your own individual learning. And I think like Mary said that best in saying that it's about like, how can you take like a piece of that and like apply it to like your everyday living? And so I'm curious, I know that I'm sure there was a lot of things that were learned like on the group level, but I'm curious like if there's anything you would be interested in sharing about like what this group taught you about like anti-racism on like an individual level.
Yeah, I think I might need to think about that a little bit. So I'm gonna throw you under the bus, Mary.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think the pause is not for a lack of things, it's for an abundance of things. Because I feel like I come away every month from the conversation just kind of buzzing with things that I didn't know before about people's experiences. And that I also like, you know, want to approach differently in my daily life. I think one thing, one particularly fruitful conversation that we had was the conversation that we had about Bell Hooks's Killing Rage. That was just like a really, like I said, like a very fruitful exchange of ideas, because I think the concepts that she was talking about were very, very new for most of the people in the group. And so like despite that, or maybe because of that, like there were just a lot of really like I don't know, the responses that people had were just very like they weren't coming at it from the theory aspect of things. They were coming at it from thinking about like, what does rage mean in our lives, and how is that different for people who are having the experiences that Bell Hooks is having as a Black woman, from like how it is for like me, for example. Like I think a lot of us coming into that conversation had always thought of rage as something that's like bad and violent and like to be avoided. And like what Bell Hooks is giving us is a different viewpoint on that. And there were people in our conversation who, you know, had that experience of having their rage suppressed by this like dominant idea that like it's a bad thing and it's something to be suppressed. So I kind of came away from that conversation thinking about how are the ways that I like walk around in the world, like looking at people and thinking about like how are the ways that I'm suppressing other people's emotions, like in the spaces that I'm in, because I'm sure that I do participate in that because it is a dominant ideology and it's something that I took for granted prior to reading that book. So that was something that I walked away from that conversation with. And ever since then, like I will never forget that conversation. Like I think it does change the way that I occupy space, or at least make me think harder about the way that I occupy space.
Yeah, when you said bell hooks, like that conversation was a really great one, and also Sika was there, so that was really cool. But yeah, I remember reading the part of the book that we ended up talking the most about, like the essay about Killing Rage. and just yeah, feeling really kind of transformed by this idea that rage is something to be accepted, and like it is just as valid as like happiness or love or other more positive emotions. And really equating like this suppression of Black rage in particular with like whiteness and how white supremacy functions in our society. And just thinking back over the many ways that like I've probably participated in that kind of thing, or at least seen it happen and not said anything. And but the way like the way that in that book, like Bell Hooks sort of explains rage and like the way in which you can sort of fight against that suppression of it was so like hopeful. Like, and I think that's one thing that we've discovered about a lot of the books we were reading, especially Bell Hooks. Though that conversation was cool because like there's such a hopeful tint to her voice about like, yeah, I mean, like this, you know, the institutions of white supremacy have like a long reach and are dominant in our lives, but there's so many radical ways to like care for one another in spite of that. And I remember leaving that conversation feeling really hopeful of like, well, there's ways to fight back against this and ways to like care about each other. And it just involves like showing up and listening to one another and really allowing each other the space to feel your emotions. So I like to think I've been a little more mindful about like all the different emotions since then, and it's definitely helped while we're in the pandemic and like a lot of different things are being suppressed. So I agree with Mary that conversation in particular was really helpful and like personally impactful. But I also really like last month's book. We read The Bluest by Toni Morrison, and I'd never read Toni Morrison before, and I'd always wanted to. So it was a very cool experience to like to read it with this group of people who I had like felt comfortable with, and I didn't have to take notes or anything because it wasn't like AP Lit. I could just sort of react to it as a person, and yeah, I think it's every month I sort of learn something new, and it's just been a cool experience.
I mean, I'm glad. I was curious if you had already gotten to the Lewis I'm glad that we're talking about the books because I so desperately wanted to hear about the process of deciding or like picking the books because, you know, when y'all first asked me to come in and do the like facilitation training, you were reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then and I think even in that conversation, I already offered like some preliminary critiques, even though I hadn't read the book. I still haven't read the book. So that, and then it was Culling Rage, and then it was The Lewis Eye, and I just was sort of like, as an outside observer, like, what's going on here with this like evolution of, because it feels like so many anti-racist book clubs have started with either How to Be an Anti-Racist or maybe Me and White Supremacy. And as much as I'm glad that people are engaging at all, I'm also wanting people to diversify like who it is that they're getting this knowledge from. So if y'all could talk about that some.
Yeah, so the first conversation that we had about how to be an anti-racist was a really interesting one. And I know like even prior to that conversation, like Priya and Devora and I had our own mini conversation while we were planning about how like there were honestly a lot of helpful things in it, but also there were some things that like we did like want to kind of question a little bit. And we were thinking about that during our conversation, but also that book did seem to be very helpful as an entry point for a lot of people into the conversation about anti-racism. I think especially because it's written for a popular audience and it's written to be read by as wide of an audience as possible, because that's kind of Ibram Kendi's project. So that was a really interesting starting point, because after that we were like, okay, well, we did this book, you know, we talked about a lot of like more like mainstream, like popularly accepted ideas about anti-racism, like maybe let's make a shift to a more radical perspective. And also we wanted to hear a woman's voice. We wanted to hear a Black woman's voice, because like there were some things about Ibram Kendi's writing that were very gendered. And we kind of wanted to get the flip side of that and get somebody else's voice in there that was different. So we did pick bell hooks for the second month. And obviously we had a really great discussion about bell hooks. And we also did talk in our discussion about like comparisons between hooks and Kendi, what things were similar, what things were different, because we had kind of picked that in response to Kendi's book. And it should be noted that like, we didn't just pick the books, like we put out a forum and we asked people like what they were interested in. We got a lot of ideas back. And then like our core team and our facilitators, like we kind of took a look at those in our debriefing session after the meeting and voted amongst ourselves. So it was, you know, drawn from the community, but we made the executive decision. And the Bluest Eye was also something that had been really popular in our suggestions, or just Toni Morrison in general. And so we did have a few people also who were like, I want to switch it up and read some fiction, which is also something that a lot of other anti-racist book club type groups aren't necessarily doing as much. They're doing more of the like reading history and reading about politics and theory and things like that, which is all very good and like we should do that. But I think fiction is also like a perfectly good entry point into the conversation as well. And for some people might even be a better one, just if that's something they connect with more than nonfiction, because I know a lot of people do. So yeah, that was kind of our process there. This month we're reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So we're shifting back to nonfiction, but that was also something that was a really popular choice among the community and focuses more on incarceration. So I think that'll be a really interesting conversation as well, because it's pivoting again.
Yeah, I remember the conversation after, I think the debrief meeting, because we always have like Mary said, we always have a prep meeting and then a debrief meeting after the monthly meeting. And so I think Devora literally showed up to the debrief and it was like, we need to take a hard left from Ibram Kendi. I don't want to read this again. And so it was really interesting. I think in a lot of ways our books have sort of been reactions to the one we just read so far. And one thing I also wanted to kind of point out in the conversation we had after our first month picking like our second book, a few people in that form that Mary mentioned where we solicited feedback about our next book asked for something like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and books that like are for white people or non-Black people learning more about anti-racism. And I remember this conversation we had of like, you know, we're figuring out whether that was what we were trying to do, and we ended up being like deciding like not really, like we're not really a space for figuring out white guilt. And I mean there are reading groups where like people have formed groups to talk about that and work through those feelings, but we kind of decided we weren't really a space for that. And so that wasn't I think became one of our you know, what we were incorporating into our book selection process as well, like really centering voices from Black and Indigenous people, learning about anti-racism through their words and their experiences. So that's also kind of something we think about a lot when we're picking our books. And one thing that's interesting is actually next month we're not doing a book at all. We're doing like a documentary. We haven't really picked that yet, but we had a lot of like suggestions from our members, and so we're sort of going to sift through that and pick one for people to watch, because we thought it might be a nice change of pace. So yeah.
So I it's probably none of my business, but I'm just nosy to want to know what some of the documentaries that people are interested in. I'm assuming probably 13th, but maybe something else, hopefully.
There were a couple. 13th was one of them. One of our members really wanted to do, what's it called? College Behind Bars. Those are the two main ones that I'm remembering right now, but I think there may have been others.
Yeah, there were quite a few that were suggested. but I don't remember Beyond 13th and College Beyond Bars. But yeah, there were like 5 or 6 suggestions. So
Go ahead, Sika. I was just gonna say those all sound really good, and I love the idea of like switching mediums to doing a documentary. And so I'm curious, like, how does someone like get involved with this book club? Like, is there still a chance to get involved, or like, yeah, what does it look like if I was like, oh, I want to do this?
yeah, so I mean, as Mary has been mentioning, we've kind of tried to make there be as many entry points as possible. We actually have a public Instagram page as well. So anyone who's interested can reach out there. We have a Gmail, like just another anti-racist book club at gmail.com. You can also just talk to me or Mary on social media. But because most of the people who have been joining are someone that we know or like from our networks. But yeah, there's a couple ways to get involved, and the idea is anyone can get involved at any time. Like you don't need to have been there from the beginning or anything like that. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, like we've mentioned, there's a lot of ways to be involved too. Once you are like, we're happy to add you to the Slack. And you can just exist in the Slack for a while and read the books if you want. There's also a discussion channel in the Slack where we try to kind of continue our monthly conversation or have people just like drop in their thoughts as they're reading. Which like anybody's welcome to engage with who's in the Slack. And then obviously the monthly meetings, which again, like I said, don't have to have finished the book to attend them. It's a great experience either way. But yeah, and I think, I'm not sure if Priya said this, but our Instagram handle is at another anti-racist book club. That's like a really good way to stay up to date with what we're doing. And even from there, you can read along if you don't want Slack, like I get it. So yeah, you can definitely get involved that way as well and just like engage with our posts and talk about the book in the comments if that's what you want to do. So there's a lot of ways to be a part of the conversation and like engage with the community.
So last question, and we asked this question of sort of everyone who does Signal Boost as a reference to the title, right? So I know you all talked about like wanting to amplify Black and Indigenous voices, but I'm wondering if there's anyone specific that you sort of want to elevate at this point, or you want people to be paying attention to more around anti-racism or around something related.
Mary.
Thanks. Okay, sorry. There's one thing that pops into my head. We were talking about like people that influence us on social media. I know one account, I think Priya, you might have introduced this account to me. I'm not 100% sure, but it's at I2Read. It's a Black woman who runs this account and posts about Black authors, all kinds of books. And it's really just like a really good entry point into learning more about like really cool literature by Black people, all genres too. There's some really cool sci-fi, fantasy, like, but also nonfiction. There's so much there, and it's a great account. So I would say follow that account. I'm sure there's other things, but Priya, if you had ideas, go for it.
Yeah, and speaking of I2Read, actually, I'm glad you brought her up because I actually forgot that I mentioned her to you. But the lady who runs that account, I don't remember her name, but she does have a GoFundMe because she's trying to open like a Black-owned bookstore of like all Black authors in, I think Texas is where she lives. So if you like check out her Instagram page, the GoFundMe is on there. It's very cool. She's doing really awesome work. So I remember being really inspired by her Instagram. Actually, her Instagram is why I wanted to start another anti-racist book club's Instagram. I'm the one who runs it. So she's awesome. And I'm glad you mentioned her. But yeah, I mean, I have learned a ton from Kimberly Crenshaw and her work with African American Policy Forum. I read a couple of their reports and I just like follow her on social media. So she's been great. And yeah, Rachel Cargill on No White Saviors is a really good Instagram account. And then Seeding Sovereignty, I've learned a lot about like Indigenous and other issues through their accounts. So yeah, I mean, Instagram these days is really popping. So a lot of good Black and Indigenous activists on there to find.
So I know we have 2 minutes, but I want to slide in this question so quickly just because you talked about Instagram, and I feel like people, it feels like to me people continue to sort of trivialize social media and the role it plays in sort of inviting people into these conversations. So just like a quick thought on the role that that's playing for you right now as individuals.
Yeah, I grapple with that a lot just because like it's so easy, like I said earlier, to get overloaded by everything on social media. And like I also said, like not everything there is useful. Not every conversation is helpful. Some of them are more harmful than they are helpful. So social media is a tough place for me, but I do feel like especially during pandemic era, like where we're not in public spaces and we're not like having opportunities to just have conversations and be exposed to people, like social media has really been, I think, a useful tool. And I think that's why it's blown up so much with a lot of the anti-racist work that's going on right now, is because like that, those are the spaces where people are. So I definitely have done a lot to like change my feed recently so that I'm following more people who are not in my networks and in my circles, who are people who are talking about these things and having these conversations, and like people that I can learn from, so that I'm not always seeing like the same people in my bubble. So that's kind of what social media has been for me.
Yeah, definitely mirroring that, like that struggle, because it can be really useful, but like if I am not careful, I can also spend 12 hours a day looking at screens. So you kind of have to really strive to maintain that balance. And one struggle that's also like I've kind of become more aware of is a lot of these pages, or any pages run by like people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, is like social media, like the platforms themselves will often make it more difficult for them to get followers and retain followers and for their posts to be seen. And there's been a lot of issues with like community guidelines being violated. And like if Black people say the word race in a YouTube video, they get demonetized. So there's a lot of problems inherent to the platforms themselves. But like Mary said, it's where a lot of people are. So, you know, the conversations happening there can be really useful if you kind of seek out the right ones and know when to disengage for your own mental health. Yeah, that's sort of my take on it.
Thank y'all so much, and thank you for answering that last question. I know we're at time. Yeah, I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I hope that folks who watch this will follow the Instagram at the very least, at another anti-racist book club. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you both so much for having us. It was great to see you, Sika, and so nice to meet you, Maya.
Yeah, saying thank you, and nice to meet you, Maya.
Thank you both for being present, and we'll talk soon.